Today I wish to speak to you about a great battle between the Romans and the barbarian horde of Gaul. These were a tribe called the Eburones, and they were led by their prince, Ambiorix, who wished to launch a ferocious war upon Rome and vanquish the forces of Julius Caesar. Today I speak to you about this great struggle, about this great fray between warriors, between philosophers, between those who desired victory. On the one side, you had Rome, there to conquer the world, there to protect its territory in southern Gaul. And on the other side, you had the people of Gaul, many of whom were bent on revolution, many of whom were drunk off of the idea of vainglorious victory over the greatest military force in the world at that time. I begin the story with a Gaulish leader named Tiomaros. He was the leader of the Treveri, a tribe of Gaul. Now, the name Tiomaros, it sounds very fascinating. Why? Because look at the name. The name is Latinized. Romans loved to put a U and an S or an E and an S after at the end of people's names. And so this is a Latinization of an ancient Gaulish name, Tiomaros. Perhaps it was originally Tiomar. The beginning of the name, Indu, it sounds like the Indus Valley. It sounds like Hindu. It sounds Indo-Aryan. Now, I could be wrong about this, and I did spend some time trying to find out the etymology of this name, but I could not find anything that was of substance. And I believe, and correct me on this if I am wrong, I believe the name is pretty much an enigma. But nonetheless, it is interesting, considering the fact that the Gauls were Indo-Europeans, and at one point in time, the Gauls and the Latins of Italy all spoke the same language. All of the peoples of Europe at one point in time spoke a similar language. They all at one point in time spoke the original Proto-Indo-European tongue. And so there must be some overlap between the languages of these peoples. And considering the fact that the Gauls were indeed Indo-European, and they spoke an Indo-European language, the name Indus Tiomata, or Tiomatos, does have some kind of similar sound to the term Indus, or the term Hindu. Just a thought. But it gives you some idea as to the ancientness of these people. There's no one in Europe named Tiomatas today. This is a very ancient name. And so Tiomatas had this goal, this aspiration to spark a revolution, a war against the Romans. And he made a call to arms against Rome, against the Roman military in Gaul. And so there was a group of Romans who were out foraging for wood, and they were suddenly attacked by a tribe of Gaul called the Eburones. And the Eburones made their ambush upon the Romans, and then they realized that they couldn't defeat the Romans. So they called for a meeting. And there was a Roman knight who was summoned to speak for Rome with the prince of the Eburones. His name was Ambiorix. And Ambiorix, he basically wanted to deceive the Romans. And he told the Romans that the Germans were on their way to attack them and that all of Gaul wants to fight them, but they have safe passage through his land. So this led to the Romans having a debate as to what they should do. Should they make a preemptive strike on the Gauls, considering the fact that the Gauls did make an ambush upon Roman troops as they were foraging for wood? Or should the Romans stay within their military camp? They had a good amount of food, they had a lot of shelter, they were quite secured in their fortification. And so the debate was between two Roman military leaders. One was Sabinus, and the other was Cotta. And Sabinus wanted to attack the Gauls. Cotta simply wanted to remain within the camp. And if the Gauls tried to attack the camp, they would have the means to defend themselves. But you know how these sorts of conversations go. You have one person who's hot-headed, and you have another person who is more level-headed. The hot-headed one will begin to make claims of being valiant and courageous, and he will say, I am courageous, I am brave, I have big balls. You are a weakling. I am strong. I want to make an attack upon the enemy. And so Sabinus made this speech to Cotta, his rival, because Cotta said, I believe we should remain in the camp. And Sabinus told Cotta, have your own way then, if you will. And he made his voice loud. He made his voice resound through the air of the camp, so that the Roman soldiers could hear him, so that they may believe that Sabinus was truly the more courageous one. And Sabinus cried out, I am not more afraid of death than the rest of you. The men will understand if disaster follows, it is you, Cotta, that they will hold responsible. If you would give your consent, by the day after tomorrow, they would have reached the nearest camp and would have their comrades by their side to share the fortune of war with them, instead of remaining isolated like outcasts and exiles to be massacred or to die of starvation. And so the voice of Sabinus reigned supreme, and they concluded that they would make an attack upon the Eburones, upon the Gauls. The soldiers, they were not entirely confident about the decision. They spent all night talking amongst themselves, trying to convince themselves that making an attack upon the Gauls was the right idea. And they worked all night, preparing their supplies for war. And they did not sleep. And when the sun arose from its slumber, the soldiers had to march. And they were deprived of rest. And so when they were walking through Gaulish territory, their column was not in order. It was clumsy and disorganized. But they weren't too worried at that moment, because supposedly they were walking through territory that was safe for them. Because remember what the Gaulish leader, Abiorix, told them: "You may have safe passage through my land." So the Romans did not expect to be attacked. But they were. They were attacked. They were ambushed by Abiorix. And Sabinus, the man who tried to flaunt his courage, he was wrong all along. And the reality was that he trusted the words of a deceiver. And in the heat of battle, it was not Sabinus who was the more prepared. It was Cotta, the level-headed one, the careful one, the cautious one, the one who wanted to remain within the safe confines of the Roman camp. Cotta, the one who may have been deemed as a coward, was now the valiant one. And the one who tried to show off how strong and how brave he was now in a state of hysteria, fear, terror, consternation. He was now in a state of not knowing what to do. And the ambush was so ferocious. The attack by the Gauls was so heavy, so vicious, so terrifying, so harrowing, that Sabinus wanted to make a surrender. And so he told Cotta, "Let us have a meeting with Ambiorix and make our surrender, so that this terror may be put to an end." Well, Cotta warned him. And Julius Caesar writes here, "But Cotta refused to go to an enemy who had not laid down his arms and would not budge from his resolve. But Sabinus, he ordered the military tribunes who were with him at the moment and the first-grade centurions to follow him. On approaching Ambiorix, he was told to lay down his arms, and he listened. He obeyed, and commanded the others to do the same. While he was discussing terms with Ambiorix, who purposely prolonged the conversation, he was gradually surrounded and then killed. They plunged their blades into his body. But Cotta, the one who wanted to remain within the safety of the camp, continued fighting. And he was soon felled by the sword of the enemy. And all of his men around him were slaughtered. And the remaining survivors ran into the camp. And there was one man by the name of Lucius Petrosidius. Lucius Petrosidius. He was the holder of the standard of the legion, which was an image of an eagle. And he saw that the Gauls were approaching the camp, and he threw the eagle, the image of the eagle, into the rampart. and he took his final stand against the enemy, and he too fell by the sword. And all the rest of the men, the survivors, those who were not slain, they fought against the enemy until nightfall. And Julius Caesar writes here, in the night, seeing that all hope was gone, every single man committed suicide. And this was the disaster that was the result of Sabinus, the result of vainglory, the result of a man who wanted to show how courageous he was, only to later cower before a vicious enemy, only to later be slain as he was trying to negotiate terms of peace. So elated were the Gauls, elated with the hubris that emanates from such a victory. They were emboldened by the flame of ambition. And so they decided to make an attack upon another Roman camp, this one commanded by a man named Cicero, the younger brother of the infamous Roman orator who went by the same name, Cicero. And so the Gauls, led by Ambiorix, the merciless, they made an attack upon the camp of Cicero. They struck the camp with flaming hot bowls of clay. They molded these little bowls of clay, and they rained down upon the camp flaming arrows. And so there was a storm of hot bowls of clay and arrows tipped with fire. And it says here in Julius Caesar's account, on the 7th day of the siege, a great gale sprang up, and the enemy began slinging molded bullets of red-hot clay and hurling incendiary darts at the huts in the camp, which, as usual in Gaul, were thatched. The huts quickly caught fire, and the strong winds spread the flames throughout the camp. The enemy raised a loud cheer, as if victory were now a certainty, and began to move up their towers and sappers' huts, and to scale the rampart with ladders. The defenders showed the greatest courage and coolness. They were surrounded by scorching heat and pelted with a hail of missiles, and knew that all their baggage, containing everything they possessed, was being burnt. Yet, not a single man deserted his post on the rampart, and hardly anyone even turned his head to look at what was happening. Every man fought in this great crisis with the utmost courage and heroism. This was by far the worst day's fighting for them. Nevertheless, it ended in their killing and wounding more of the enemy than on any other day. And there were two Roman warriors, Pullo and Vorenus. And these men were rivals. They rivaled over who could be the best soldier. And both of them thought that they were the superior warrior. And they would argue. And during the battle, Pullo goaded Vorenus to make an attack upon the invading Gauls. "Why hesitate, Vorenus?" said Pullo. What better opportunity do you want to prove your courage? Today shall decide between us. And Pulo advanced toward the enemy, and he found the thickest rank of the Gauls and made his attack. And so Varenus, seeing his rival Pulo make his attack upon the enemy, rose up himself and charged toward the Gauls. Pulo hurled his spear and struck one of the enemy. And the enemy protected the wounded warrior by hovering over him and protecting him with their shields. And they fired their missiles at Pulo and prevented him from moving any closer. And a Gaul threw his spear toward Pulo, and the spear pierced Pulo's shield, and his sword belt was struck, and he could not unsheathe his sword. And so Varenus, seeing Pulo in trouble, even though Pulo was his rival, Varenus, who was just being taunted by Pulo, went out to rescue Pulo. And it says here, Varenus ran up to rescue him in his distress. And all the Gauls immediately left Pulo, who they thought had been mortally wounded by the javelin, and turned upon Varenus. Varenus drew his sword, and fighting hand to hand, killed one of his assailants, and drove the rest back a little. But pressing on too eagerly, he stumbled down a steep slope and fell. It was now his turn to be surrounded, but Pulo came to his aid. Both of them escaped unhurt, and after killing a number of the enemy, returned to camp covered with glory. Covered with glory. An amazing use of words, I must say. And so the camp was surrounded by 60,000 Gauls. Every man was involved in the fight, even the wounded. There was no room. There was no time. There was no privilege to allow any of the wounded to rest. All of the men had to fight, including the wounded. And so there they were, surrounded by a sea of barbarians, surrounded by a sea of savages, sophisticated in the art of war, thirsty to slaughter every Roman in their sight, thirsty to shed the blood of a Roman. Cicero was desperate. He tried to send out messengers to let Julius Caesar know what was happening. The Gauls caught the messengers, and before the eyes of the watching Romans, tortured them to death. What was a man to do? What was a leader to do to rescue his people, to save his people from destruction? There was a Gallic warrior in the camp of the Romans. He was a friend of Rome. He had a slave, and he promised his slave freedom if he would exit the camp and bring a message to Julius Caesar. And so he gave a message to his slave, and the slave exited the camp and traveled all the way to Julius Caesar without being detected, because he was indeed a fellow Gaul. And the other Gauls did not know that he was acting as a messenger. He made it to Julius Caesar, let him know that Cicero and his camp was surrounded by 60,000 Gauls. Julius Caesar readied his men and began the journey to Cicero's camp. He sent a messenger to Cicero's camp to let him know that he was on the way. The messenger had a spear, and on the tip of the spear was the message. And the reason why they did this was because if the messenger could not enter the camp to deliver the message, he could then throw the spear, and the spear would hit a wall of the camp, and somebody in the camp could then pull out the spear and read the message. And so this messenger traveled all the way to Cicero's camp. He could not enter, and so he threw the spear as hard as he could, and the spear hit a wall of the camp. And it went undetected for 2 days until a Roman soldier noticed it, pulled out the spear, and saw the message. He gave the message to Cicero, who then read it out to all of his soldiers, who then cheered, elated, relieved by the fact that Julius Caesar was on his way. Well, the Gauls had their own intelligence. The Gauls had a very sophisticated network of intelligence officers. They say that a Gaulish intelligence officer could bring a message 15 miles per hour. And they were very efficient at spying upon the Romans' movements. Well, the Gauls found out that Julius Caesar was on his way. And they were so full of confidence and hubris. They were so emboldened by the flame of ambition that they decided to leave Cicero's camp and head directly towards Julius Caesar himself. And they saw Julius Caesar, and they saw his troops, and eventually, after some time, they made the attack. Julius Caesar did not go full throttle in attacking the Gauls. No. He kept his men in control, although there were some skirmishes between Roman troops and Gaulish troops. For the most part, Julius Caesar's army was kept contained. But Julius Caesar had a strategy. He had a plan. The plan was to act scared. The plan was not to act blazoned with bravery and courage. The plan was to act like cowards and to run away. And run away they did. They ran into the camp, into Julius Caesar's camp. And around the camp were trenches, and the Gauls filled up the trenches, and they were so full of confidence. And Julius Caesar blocked all of the entrances, and the Gauls tried to break in. And then Julius Caesar told his men, "Unleash hell." And the cavalry of Julius Caesar was unleashed, and they stormed the Gaulish ranks and slaughtered many a Gaul. Many a barbarian was felled by the swords of the Romans. The Gauls fled so precipitatedly that not a single one stayed to strike a blow. Many were killed, and all the rest threw away their arms. And that was how Julius Caesar defeated such a tenacious body of Gauls, such an ambitious storm of warriors. This was the story of how the level-headed brought victory, and how those who wanted to appear courageous, led their men to destruction. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.